Welcome to the 14th web seminar of Computational Social Science Lab, the CSSL CUHK. Today we are very glad we have invited Professor Christopher Hosha. He is a full professor of cognitive science at ETH Zurich, with an emphasis on applied cognitive science. He is also the program director of Future Resilient Systems, FRS, program at the Singapore ETH Center, as well as co-director of Future Cities Lab, heading a research group on cognition, perception, and behavior in urban environments. His topic sounds very interesting. I have been lucky to have seen some very interesting video from his talk. So we all very much looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks to you and your team for inviting me to this webinar and giving me the opportunity to present some of the work that we have been doing in Zurich and in Singapore over the last decade to you. What I'm trying to achieve in this talk is to give you a bit of an understanding of how we see the relation between spatial behavior and environmental structure, and how we address that with both targeted and large-scale human data. As you said in the introduction, I'm a professor for cognitive science at ETH Zurich, and ETH Zurich is a very technical university. I'm one of the few psychologists who serve at ETH, but behavior science and cognitive sciences and neuroscience have become more important over the last decade or two, also at ETH Zurich, because there's a growing understanding that in order to design environments, in order to design machines, in order to design artifacts, it is important to understand the human side of things. And that is my role at ETH. And it also is my role at the Singapore ETH Center, which is a subsidiary of ETH Zurich, run jointly with the National Research Foundation of Singapore, and that has a number of research programs going on. And I'm lucky to be involved in two of them, one being the Future Cities Laboratory Global, and the other being Future Resilient Systems. While the trigger for getting in touch with you was actually my role in Future Resilient Systems, I will not be talking too much about that. In Future Resilient Systems, we look at infrastructure resilience, social resilience, community resilience. And again, my team brings in the human perspective. We do a lot of work that you might otherwise find perhaps in areas of behavior economics and behavior finance, but also other aspects of human factors. For today, I will really focus on the work that relates to Future Cities Laboratory Global and my team here in Zurich. I'm joining you from Zurich. It's actually a fairly sunny morning here in Zurich. And really, I want to focus on this understanding of spatial behavior and environmental structure. And this is clearly a question at the interface of psychology and related behavioral sciences and architecture and other spatial sciences. Let's hope that my slide deck works. So I already alluded to the fact that there's several labs involved here. So I run in my role as professor a laboratory at ETH in Zurich, here a view of the lake, where we focus on topics such as spatial navigation. We also look at the spatial abilities of architects, and we look at how people appraise different environmental features, how they enjoy or not enjoy being in certain buildings or neighborhoods. What is their emotional response? What is their cognitive response? And what is their behavioral response? A topic where psychology is its traditional form of interviews, questionnaires, surveys, can be connected with more deep data-driven approaches such as physiological measurements, tracking behaviors, etc. And I'll show you more of that over the next hour. Then, for the past 7 years, I've been involved in Singapore at the Singapore ETH Center, and there our team has a focus on cognition, perception, and behavior in urban environments. And I think the two images already illustrate that in order to understand the impact of environment, one has to look at the real breadth of experience and the real breadth of different types of environments and understand those spaces and be able to quantify those spaces so that we can measure them in a scientific manner. And one of the long-term goals here is what we call pre-occupancy evaluation for real-world scenarios. A lot of research in the field of architecture comes in after the fact, after the buildings are already there. And our intention is, with a range of measures that I will be talking about, to bring the decision-making and the understanding closer to the design process rather than making it an afterthought. It's also the case that the work that I do is embedded in a larger team and a larger network. I'm a psychologist by training. I have some technical understanding, but much less technical understanding than some of the slides I'll be showing suggest. And also, I am not an architect by training, but this is an important link to me. I have been working with my colleague, Professor Ruth Conroy Dalton, who is now at Northumbria University in Newcastle for the past 18 years. And we have really developed jointly this portfolio of research that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm heavily relying on that collaboration for what I'm presenting today. As you see here, she deals in very similar topics with spatial navigation and wayfinding, architectural cognition, and space syntax, which is one of the architectural ways of making measurements in a systematic fashion of the built environment that allows to make a link between architectural design intention and intuition and the more sciencey world of behavior, science, and economics. Let me go to a very different kind of space, because this kind of space is much more in line with what we typically do our research on. This is the metro station, the MRT station, right in the center of Orchard Road, underneath one of the high-end shopping malls, Ion Orchard. It does not look glitzy at all because it's in the belly of the shopping mall. It connects underground with numerous other spaces with the MRT station. And those of you in Hong Kong and other major cities in Asia, Southeast Asia, will be very familiar with this kind of setting, which at the same time is quite alien to most of our European counterparts. It is this density of information, it is this density of space that connects to a vast network of spatial alternatives. It is the co-presence of many other people that defines this decision-making situation, this experience of humans. What we've been trying to do, both in the work that we do in Singapore, but also in the work that we do in European and North American sites, is to understand the contributing factors to the human experience here. And here we can ask questions: how does the environment, how does it shape human cognition, behavior, and perception? And also very practical questions such as, how do people navigate these underground mazes? And especially spend a bit of time in Hong Kong, I felt that there's equally many spaces that have these quite challenging properties. And there's different domains that have an impact here. One clearly is architecture, planning, spatial analysis, and these disciplines bring in the design, but they also bring in systematic ways of analyzing design by looking at spatial configuration, looking at visibility, at spatial features, looking at attractions and land use, looking at informations in science. Then, and this is close to my heart and my scientific origin, there's disciplines such as cognitive psychology that provide a deep understanding of the contributing factors in the human mind that shape our relation with the built environment and our behaviors in the built environment. For example, we can look here at emotions, at attention, at vision, at knowledge, at the sense of orientation, motivation, decisions, and others. And then there's more applied fields of science that also have an impact on this matter of how can we use different types of data to understand the interplay between human and environment. And there's an emphasis on different types of environments in the fields of human factors, user experience, and usability, but ultimately, methodologically, and in its psychological intent, they are very similar. And in user experience and usability research, we talk about preferences, we talk about errors, about emotions, about satisfaction, about appraisal, about stress, about well-being, about mental health, physical health, and similar topics. And there's a strong relation between what we have there and what we should have in the field of architecture as well. And this is the shape in which a lot of our research is actually happening. Let me further try to position this topic of architecture and cognition that we compound into the term of architectural cognition in the context of design. In the simplest sense, there's a triangle that defines design. There has to be an artifact that is to be designed. In the case of architecture, that's buildings or neighborhoods. There has to be a designer, which in the case of architecture is the architect, and there's users. The role of the building and the role of the user are quite obvious, but what is the relation between the architect and the user? And what we have come to conclude after quite a bit of research, and not only us, but also the field of architecture themselves, is that the role of architects in relation to the users is to anticipate their behaviors, to understand and know ahead of time how users might respond to different building design decisions. And the role of science and the role of the kind of data that I want to be talking about now is to help understand the behavior of users, translate it with scientific methods, theories, and data sets, and thus inform the architect in their design decision making. And this is not at all a trivial objective. If you look at the architectural design process, here the one defined by the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, you start out with strategic definitions, preparations, briefs, concept design, and then through various steps, you get more concrete, you construct, you hand over, and then it is in use. By contrast, the scientific method has very little impact in some of those design phases so far. For almost 50 years, there's a well-established field of post-occupancy evaluation, of doing real-world experiments to understand how people use spaces, how they use buildings, how they roam around the city. But there's other approaches, such as full-scale mock-ups of parts of buildings to understand different usability questions, running behavior experiments in virtual reality, which has really come to the forefront in the last decade or so, various kinds of spatial analysis, such as this space syntax that I briefly alluded to, but also, and to some of my colleagues, that really is the pinnacle of what we can do right now, is to do agent-based simulations, where we program multiplayer systems or multi-agent systems to exhibit human-like behaviors so that we can anticipate the movement patterns and the responses to the built environment of both individuals and larger groups of people. And let me now move step by step a bit away from this theoretical foundation and illustrate for the remainder of my talk really much more visually. And maybe start by giving you a bit of a glimpse of what are the kinds of methods that we use. Very often we start with wayfinding experiments in the real world. In the simplest case, it just means following people around with a video camera, doing video recordings, and then sitting down afterwards and doing very meticulous analyses of their decision-making, of their movement choices, of their routes, and of their errors. Very much like you would have in the field of human-computer interaction or usability. But increasingly, this is augmented with techniques such as mobile eye tracking or with psychophysiological methods where, for example, people wear a sensor device for heart rate variability or skin conductance to get a sense of their arousal, stress response, and emotional appraisal. A second area where we collect data is wayfinding experiments in virtual environments, where we, as far as the human is concerned, might be collecting the same kinds of data patterns, but we do this in this pre-occupancy evaluation mode, where we can test design variations and very systematically manipulate environmental conditions because it's in virtual reality. We can make systematic variations and we can measure the impact of it. This is underpinned by various kinds of spatial analysis that quantify the configuration of built environments and their affordances, and that have proven both at the urban level, but also at the building level to be quite predictive of human behavior in the built environment. And then at the fourth step, these three different kinds of data come together in these agent-based models and computational tools that simulate human behavior realistically by what we call cognitively plausible agents. And the key idea with these cognitively plausible agents is that they are imperfect, that they can be stressed, that they can develop tunnel vision if they are too stressed, that they might be overwhelmed by the information that is available to them. And for example, in our work with airports around the world, we have found that these cognitively plausible agents are much better predictors of human behavior than making falsely optimistic assumptions about people's spatial abilities, their knowledge about the building, or their awareness of where they are in space. Let me illustrate some of our behavioral experiment approaches. What you see here in the foreground is a young lady that is wearing these funny glasses, which are in fact eye tracking glasses that have little cameras that capture the movement of the eyes, and also a forward-looking camera that captures the scene, which allows us in retrospect to reconstruct the visual attention patterns of the person. And the lady walking behind her is an observer who takes notes, and maybe also carrying a video camera. You might have a camera on the person themselves to capture really a rich data set about the decision making in these complex underground or above ground spaces that often are populated by many people. This is an illustration from a study that we've done about 10 years ago at Frankfurt Airport. Here you see the slightly more clunky eye tracking glasses worn by the two participants. In this kind of study, we also look at how pairs and small groups of people navigate. This is done at Frankfurt Airport, one of the most notoriously difficult airports to navigate because of certain spatial features and complexity. And the orange donut illustrates where people are looking while they are moving through the environment. And then afterwards, there's quite deliberate coding done to understand where do people look, how long do they dwell on something, and how is the correspondence between the visual attention that they show and their attitudes to the environment, as well as their movement choices and potential errors. A large part of what I will be talking about today is really about moving through the built environment, because to us this is indicative of how the built environment shapes human behavior, and it correlates with other aspects of human responses such as emotion and general appraisal. And the starting point of a lot of our work has been this, and please excuse me for introducing yet another slightly more theoretical concept here, is our work on getting lost in buildings, where we in some sense have a similar trinity to the one I introduced a bit earlier. Again, we have a building that has certain spatial features, such as how complex its layout is, how articulated and differentiated the space is, so how easy it is to tell where exactly in a space you are, the role of signage and the role of visual access, how much you can see from one important point in the building to another. But then there's two important human side elements. One is the cognitive map, which is an umbrella term for all the mental representations that people make of the built environment when it is outside of their current field of view, your understanding of the space that you are in. And then there's a very important aspect that I'll come back to later as well, and that is that people differ in their strategies, and that they have individual differences in their spatial abilities, and that all of these human side properties have a strong impact on behavior in space, and that we have to measure both the human and the environment to get an understanding. Let me show you a very simple case study that is actually a complex building. The Seattle Central Library, and depicted here on the right-hand side, is a beautiful sculpture right in the downtown district of Seattle, Washington. And it is a library for the 21st century. It has this slightly funny shape from the outside, and it has a similarly complex inside structure, and it brings together many functions, social functions, book storage, digital data access, etc. And in its complexity, it has received a lot of attention from architects around the world and architecture critics, but also from behavior scientists. And we have been lucky over a period of 5 or 6 years to run a number of experiments in that building to understand how does it work. And why do we do this in a building like this? Well, one is it's designed by one of the most famous architecture companies, namely by Rem Koolhaas and his colleagues in Rotterdam. And the lead architect here on the project was Joshua Prince Ramus. And really the quote summarizes everything I have to say about the relation between architect and user. Says wayfinding wasn't done perfectly, to put it kindly. When you understand the building, it is very simple, just a series of boxes. But what we didn't understand is, to the uninitiated person, someone not an architect or library staffer, it can be complex if they don't understand that. What we thought is blatantly obvious isn't. And this is also reflected in how people respond to the building, for example, in social media comments. And one comment that, again, is very telling is, I found the ever-narrowing floating escalators to be frightening and left the building as soon as I could figure out how to get out. hoping I wouldn't have an anxiety attack first. So there's behavioral and emotional components that this building triggers. And we went in and did experiments. We just told people, well, find a specific book, find the DVDs, find the cafe, find a social space. And then we looked at their behaviors. And I'll just illustrate this here with this collection of movement traces that represent maybe 40 or 50 participants. All of these lines are from a specific, very simple task. Go find the section for non-fiction DVDs, and the shortest path is illustrated here by the dotted blue line. And as you can easily see, most people do not find that shortest path. They wander around the building, although they have a clear choice to make and a clear destination, because they don't understand the structure of the space as much as the architects did. And they wander around, they go to different parts of the building. Some get completely lost and have to recover. Some only make smaller detours, but many clearly also express their frustration. And how do we go about capturing these movement traces? Because this is in the real world. This is not in virtual reality, where actually the computer does all that automatically for you and generates you even nicer images than this. What we've done is we've developed together with colleagues from computer science and architecture and human geography, a number of observational tools. For example, this tablet-based app here, it's called People Watcher, where you load in a floor plan of the building, and then in real time, while following the person, you take notes on specific actions and maybe complement that with an audio recording of how people speak about the building while they're taking a tour through the building. All of this work together has gone into an edited book by Ruth Dalton and myself called Take One Building, an interdisciplinary research perspective of the Central Library in Seattle, that really brings together different opinions and different sciences in understanding this kind of space. I can highly recommend it if you want to get a better sense of multidisciplinary approaches to capturing behavior in larger spaces. Let me juxtapose this with a very simple experiment. This was done more than 10 years ago when I was first a visiting scholar at University College London. Here we took very simple layouts illustrated on the right-hand side from some seminal research in architectural psychology and represented it in different formats. We showed to people floor plans of the building. We showed to people these isometric views, but we also immersed them in virtual reality. Here you see a slightly older cave environment where the environment is projected on all the walls and on the floor and allows people, like in a high-end video game, to move through that space. And what we find is that not only is the complexity of the building as of its shape highly predictive of behavior, but it's also the matter of representation matters, whether you show people a floor plan, whether you show people a rendering on the screen, or whether they really experience it in a first-person perspective, moving about virtually in a cave-like environment. Another illustration of our research is, for me, is like the guinea pig of our real-world experiments. This is the conference center in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Germany, on a lake. And we have a cognitive science conference there every year for a week. And every year we have the opportunity to collect data on people's behavior. And it's a 1970s building. And on the left-hand side, you see the main entrance hall. And what you can immediately grasp is that the main entrance hall does not provide you any information about how the building is organized. And as an architect, you might then do a big spatial gesture and cut in an atrium, as illustrated on the right-hand side. And then from a behavior science point of view, this triggers the question, what is the impact of this? It's obvious that people would find this more spacious, but does it also change their behaviors? Does it change how they move about in the building? And now we did a couple of different studies here. One was to take the virtual reality simulations to the actual building and show it to participants. I'm not going to go too deep into that now. More importantly, what we did is we did several of those variations in virtual reality and then captured, again, movement traces in VR, comparing for a set of destination differences in people's behavior, depending on whether there was an atrium or not, in what direction the staircases were oriented, what kind of open connections were visible or not visible, and other sometimes more subtle changes in the design of the environment. And what we do find is, A, that there is a reasonable correspondence between the real world and a direct replica of the building in virtual reality. And then, more importantly, there's a strong sensitivity to design variations, such as this atrium. It really changes people's perception of the building, but also changes people's actual behavior in the space. Let me complement this really with this brief illustration of some more of our eye movement data. What you see here at the bottom is again eye tracking data from Frankfurt Airport. And this is very similar to the kind of eye tracking data that you might have in a human-computer interaction usability context. And for us, it has become very clear that there's a translation to be made from human-computer interaction to architectural design, because it turns out there's such a strong correspondence in the human behaviors and in the kinds of data that you can collect about their behavior in space, just as much as in digital environments. This is, again, if you want to go deep on this, I recommend this Springer book on architecture and interaction that brings together various perspectives of computer scientists, human geographers, architects, and psychologists on this very topic. Let me now change gears a little bit and talk to you about something that at the surface is not in space, or at least not in architectural space. Let me talk about a video game project. It's called Sea Hero Quest, and it probably is the trigger why I was invited to talk to you here. And I'm here, I again want to emphasize this is a strong collaboration with my colleague Ruth Conroy-Dalton, and for the next few slides, I'll heavily rely on a keynote address that she just gave at the Conference for Spatial Information Theory 2 months ago in Kobe. What is Sea Hero Quest? It is an opportunity to conduct population-level wayfinding experiments. This is just an illustration from the promotional materials of it. The company Glitches was tasked with running with designing this video game on behalf of Alzheimer's Research UK and sponsored by German Telecom. And we were brought in together with other scientists in different roles to help make this a meaningful data collection exercise for Alzheimer's research, but also for a more general understanding of spatial abilities and spatial behavior across the lifespan. So what is Sea Hero Quest? Sea Hero Quest is a population-level wayfinding environment, and I want to talk very briefly about how difficult it is to make meaningful choices about level design. And there's many other topics here, such as citizen science, comparison of virtual and real-world studies. There's navigational differences between countries. There's the effect of spatial structure on wayfinding performance. There's looking at the impact of cities and rural effects, role of landmarks, entropy of street networks, and similar elements. And there have been, I think, almost 20 publications coming out of this data set already. And you might wonder why. And let's look at this in a bit more detail. Sea Hero Quest is a video game that was designed for mobile phones. And the purpose was to gather the most comprehensive database of normal navigation behavior from an entire population across the globe. It is currently the world's largest database of navigation ability. It is designed to help us understand early signs of dementia, in the sense that early signs of dementia are often indicated by a decline in navigation ability. Your ability to find your way around the world is one of the first things to go. And there's a strong desire in the medical profession to allow for an earlier diagnosis, because the more can then be done to help people live with the symptoms and maybe alleviate them. And it has been quite difficult to meaningfully measure navigation ability, let alone the measured decline. And this game is not for Alzheimer's patients or for patients of cognitive decline. It is for normal people, for non-affected people, to get a sense of the population level behaviors that can then be compared in more clinical studies with dementia patients, Alzheimer's patients, and others. And this logic of Sea Hero Quest also has the slightly poetic underpinning that you are the grandson of an elderly person whose memories you are collecting in this seafaring game because your relative was a seafarer earlier in their life. There's a large group of people involved here. Let me highlight 2 or 3 of them. Michael Hornberger, a clinical researcher, and Hugo Spears, a spatial cognition researcher at University College London, are the main driving forces behind this consortium. And you'll see that a lot of the publications are driven by Antoine Coutrou, who used to be with Hugo Spears, but now is at CNRS in France. Let me give you a few more illustrations here. So we're talking about a mobile video game that tests spatial orientation. It was distributed as a free app on the App Store and Google Play. Players can control a boat that navigates 75 game levels that have very different designs, and that does test different types of navigational skill. And also players are asked to provide background demographics at large scale, so that we have behavioral data, but also some understanding of the demographics of the people and some self-assessment of spatial abilities and cognitive factors. Not going to go into too much detail here, just to illustrate very different types of tasks. First, they just have to learn to navigate the boat. Then they have to do some tasks that we call path integration, where you move around and have to memorize where you started from, and then have to send a flare back to your starting point. There's wayfinding tasks, where you maybe have to learn a map and then find your way based on a memorized, no longer visible map. You might have to explore a very maze-like environment and memorize the position of different beacons. And there might also be a monster photography capture, where you have to chase monsters and thus get a bit more directly engaged with the spatial environment. There should be a video playing here now that illustrates how the gameplay was like. Like I said before, it's for a mobile device, but we also developed a virtual reality version for Samsung Gear and other devices over the years. And on Oculus.com, you can still get access to a virtual reality version. And of course, as a scientist, there's lab versions available for research purposes. Why has this been such an influential experimental paradigm? I think it has largely been such an influential experimental paradigm because more than 4 million players have downloaded the game and played it to a certain degree of the levels. And it's not only men, so we have a quite good distribution of gender, and we have participants, of course, to very different degrees from various parts of the world. So it really captures the entire population, if you will, and make for certain adjustments. It's always difficult to compare online experimentation with real-world experimentation, but if we compare this online large-scale data collection to the targeted high-resolution one-on-one data capture that we typically have in the laboratory or in real-world navigation studies, you would easily come to astronomical costs, and you would need thousands of years or thousands of research assistants to conduct this kind of research. So research at this scale clearly can only be done in a digital environment and with the help of online data collection. Again, Sea Hero Quest is just a handheld video game, but it generates movement patterns that are actually in their extent and in their complexity and in their variability across people quite similar to the movement patterns that I showed you maybe 10 slides ago about the Seattle Central Library. The movement paths of people in this game environment, because you're moving around with your boat, are very much like the kinds of movement patterns that you could have in a weird city or in a weird building in terms of how they are controlled by the corridors or by the little rivers here that you're navigating with the boat. But of course, they can have very different shapes because they're fictitious environments. And that invites then the question of how do these different types of shapes feature in people's responses, and are there differences in how people are able to navigate these spaces? And are those just related to sheer complexity of the spaces, or is this maybe also related to some features such as spatial regularities that correspond to the lived experience of people, maybe people who grew up in grid-like environments like North American urban centers might deal better with similar game levels that have that property, while somebody coming from a medieval town in Germany, like perhaps Heidelberg or Freiburg, would have very different spatial preferences and is attuned to different kinds of behaviors. And of course, this is something that we are looking into here. But before going deeper here, let me very briefly talk about the level of the challenge of designing appropriate game design levels here. If you want to collect data that's not just about games, but that is about people's behavior in real spaces ultimately, right? So you could easily just be designing mazes, right? And this is what we initially started with a challenge of how can we move from maze-like environments to something that makes sense to people. And I'll cut this very short. There is some good research at the interface of architecture and cognition, largely done by Michael O'Neill in the 1990s, that has shown that some very simple measures such as interconnection density, which is the number of connections between any points in a network graph, can be highly predictive of people's navigational difficulties. Similarly, in space syntax, and I don't have the time to go into too much detail here, there's this notion of intelligibility, which is ultimately a correlation between local connectivity and the position of any node in the larger network, can be also highly predictive of whether people understand the structure of a space and how efficiently they can navigate in it. And this is just to illustrate a proper maze like the one illustrated here has very low intelligibility. Based on these more theoretical and method-driven or formalism-driven notions, we designed a large set of potential game environments. We gave to the game designers, who then turned that into emotionally and visually appealing and meaningful variations that were then resulting in maybe water-like environments like this. That could be analyzed again with space syntax for the visibility patterns and the movement patterns that they afford. And we designed furthermore the role of level geometry, how difficult the overall world is, but also looking at local and global landmarks and different navigational aids. And without going into too much detail, this video we already saw. We designed different types of landmarks to be distributed in the environment and did psychological tests rating how salient, how easy to identify, memorize, and spot in the environment these various landmarks would be, and then systematically played with their placement to have a range of complexities, which then led to questions of where does one place those landmarks, which was again systematically tested and led to designs like this, which again could be analyzed spatially and were then tested by architects, game designers, and psychologists interested in the spatial cognition research to collect as much feedback as possible to have these environments that don't necessarily look like the spaces you would navigate in normally, but that have certain underlying configuration properties in common with spatial environments that you might have in different types of urban settings. The first question that then, of course, comes up is, what is the relation between the performance in a video game like this and reality? One way of addressing that is, this is done with very, very much smaller numbers of participants, is to get to do a real world study. And given that most of our colleagues are in London and Paris, we conducted studies in those two cities, allowed people to find their way around local neighborhoods that were not too familiar to them, and looked at how does the behavior of these people in the video game correspond to their behavior in the real environments. And this should also be a video here. Yep. And it illustrates that, of course, the behaviors of people are constrained, again, by the street network, etc. And it also illustrates that behaviors in the real world, when you follow individuals around, is quite different in terms of how they are spatially distributed from this highly abstract video game environment on the right-hand side. But, and this is really the crucial element, one key metric is corresponding. Those people who needed a longer time to find their way around the area of Soho in London to find those 4 hidden destinations took equally longer in the video game environment and vice versa. So if you're quick in real life, you're also quick in navigating a virtual space. And if you're slow in the real world, you're also much slower in the virtual world, which is an initial sign of correspondence between these environments or these modalities. What also comes out here already is that there's a male advantage in performance for wayfinding, both in the two cities, but also in the game environment. And let's look at this in a bit more detail. So moving away from the real world data now back to the video game data, there's analysis of global navigational differences. we've tested more than 2.5 million people, so there's 2.5 million data sets or traces that are deep enough to allow for meaningful analysis. They come with different distribution, of course, from every country in the world. And it turns out that the spatial ability of the population of a country is correlated with economic wealth. When I talk about spatial ability here, I'm not alluding to any inherited or genetic differences in people. I'm just talking about the ability of people to perform a navigational task in this video game environment and also in the corresponding Western real-world settings that we've looked at. And here the contrasts are quite striking. It is also the case that we find relatively strong gender inequality, but it turns out that that again is not based on biological differences between the genders. It is clearly attributable to cultural factors, because those countries where there's a strong degree of gender inequality, both in terms of attitudes and socioeconomic status of men and women, the gender differences are much more pronounced. Let me briefly illustrate some of our key findings here. First of all, if we look at performance over time, turns out that probably everybody in the room is already in some kind of performance decline when it comes to the ability to play a video game like Sea Hero Quest here on a phone. It turns out that there is a steady decline in people's ability, and that is not only to be attributed to video game experience, because you can statistically control for that. It is really the case that the older you get, the more difficult it becomes for you to navigate those kinds of virtual spaces. And there's some correspondence of that age-related decline, of course, also in real spaces. Having said that, there is, of course, this funny thing in the data that the oldest participants that we have are much better than middle-aged. But if you look at the indicators of variance, it becomes very clear that what we have here is a survivor bias, that only very old people are present in our sample, and that those who could be recruited for playing Sea Hero Quest are just the very fit elderly people, and that thus explains their superior performance. The other observation that we make is this steady difference between men and women, and the parallel, the similar decline. And clearly this difference is to some extent definitely attributable to the fact that it's a digitally mediated experience, but it is also the case that in real world wayfinding, men and women do differ, and the gender effect size here is actually quite substantial. But if you take a more detailed look, you find that, go back here, you find that there is a very strong correspondence between the gender difference in society. This is ranked data looking at attitudes and socioeconomic status, corresponds very strongly to gender differences in the game. And this has probably a correspondence in some of our real world studies, where we consistently find that men and women have very different self-assessments of how they good are at spatial navigation. It turns out that very often men say, well, I can do this, while the women are more polite and say, well, I will struggle with this task. But if we then look at the actual performance in the Seattle Central Public Library or in this conference center and in numerous other complex spaces, the differences that we do observe are much smaller than the expectations that people have of themselves. And let me bring this all together by looking at the impact of city versus rural environments and the degree of spatial entropy that people are exposed to, because this is what brought us on the cover of Nature a few months ago, this notion of lost in the city, this main observation that actually grid-planned urban environments hamper future spatial navigational skills, at least when it comes to navigating environments that are not as grid-like as North American cities. And this is actually illustrated quite nicely here on the left-hand side. If you compare people who on the question of whether they come from a city or a rural environment in our video game, and compare that across our very large data set, you find that in this game, where you've seen that the environments are quite curvy and complex and non-grid-like, those people who have a non-city background have a much higher degree of wayfinding performance than those coming from city and often maybe more grid-like environments. And again, you similarly find the male versus female difference. But for me, really, the striking finding is that that the spatial environment that you dominantly live in has such a strong impact, something that had not been demonstrated in such a manner before. And if you look at the on the right-hand side at a linear mixed model that also takes into account the different nations, you do find that there's a strong correspondence that has to do with the origin of people, and the environmental differences clearly come to the forefront when you control for age, gender, and education. So looking at home environments and countries becomes quite relevant. Of course, it's very difficult to compare at the country level. But what we can then do is we can look at prominent cities in a subset of those countries, and can look at, for example, the spatial situation in cities like Prague or Chicago. And let's start with the bottom in Chicago, which is so nicely gridly oriented. Almost all of the streets orientations are close to the cardinal directions. While in a city like Prague, you have somewhat more streets that go north, south, and east, west, but you also have a large number of streets that go in oblique angles and diagonal. And this is the main difference that we base our analyses on. And this is what we call the street network entropy level, in terms of how much you can, how much variance you have, or how much entropy you have in terms of the orientation of street corners and cardinal directions. And here you find a very clear pattern that these environmental effect sizes from the previous page and the street network entropy measures are highly correlated. Minus 0.60 is something that in psychology you quite rarely find. This is clearly partly driven by the fact that we have a very large data set underlying this, but it's only 36 locations that we are ultimately looking at here, and still you get a very strong effect out of this. And I wonder what happened to the graphic in this slide, but what also comes out here, if you zoom in into different gaming levels, is that people have a strong correspondence with how gritty or non-gritty the environment is in the game level, and there's a city of origin, and this basically boils down to people from more grid-like environments being better in grid-like gaming levels, and vice versa. And I'll stop with my contribution about Sea-Hero Quest here, point to the fact that this is really looking at the population level data. There's a lot more on research going on with clinical teams and cohort studies. All of that data is open access, available from Sea-Hero Quest. There's partnerships with different worldwide organizations and numerous academic institutions that are testing new populations. This is an open invitation across the world to bring in data sets that are more controlled and more targeted from different countries and different cultural regions. And it also is an opportunity to connect this video game-based data with more targeted and more in-depth analyses, for example, by having people play these game levels in immersive virtual reality with head-mounted displays, or in a cave, or with eye tracking on a computer screen that allows us to then dig deeper into what is the relation between those spatial trajectories and the gaze patterns that we have in visual attention research via eye tracking. Maybe let's come back to a more architectural level and look more at behaviors in real buildings, right? And one topic that we have addressed increasingly at the interface with architecture over the last 3-4 years is looking at cognitive occupancy modeling in BIM systems. BIM systems are building information models, becoming increasingly relevant in architecture for digital planning and maintenance of buildings. And this is an illustration of the kind of setup that we would be looking at. You might have on the top left-hand side, you might have a building, in this case, a a cubic building that again is in Germany by Sana Architects, a quite cutting edge architecture company. This is a museum-like space. And we take the digital model of the building, pre-process some of the digital model to identify, for example, what are movable spaces, what are spaces on which people could be walking. We do analyses of what's called isovis, so visibility fields around any point in space to look at the spatial visual relations. We identify, based on the building program, different zones in the building and so-called threshold graphs of different parts of the building and how people might navigate between them. And then we do different kinds of experiments on this virtual building, which does exist in the real world, but we focus on the virtual version of it. And we take the building as it is, with its encased staircases that limit visibility, and normal floor plans, and compare it to versions where we cut in an atrium, like in the other example that I showed you earlier, or where, as a slightly more modest spatial variation, we put glass encasements around the staircases rather than the concrete encasements, thus allowing for more visual permeability of the building. We then conduct an online experiment that is with Mechanical Turk and other panel platforms online. So people sit at home at their computers. We also have a comparison study where we invite them into our decision science lab, where we have 30 computers and where we can test people's performance on site. And we let them navigate through that building. And then we compare the behavior that humans show to the behaviors that you would expect from computational agents. And of course, there's a long history of using computational agents in architectural simulation. But even in sophisticated cases, such as airport simulation, it's often the case that you assume that you have agents that know exactly where they are and that know exactly where they have to go and that are aware of all the movement choices that they have. And this is what traditionally has been modeled as shortest path agents that always take the perfect choice. And this is also illustrated here in the middle panel here, right? All the shortest path agents with maybe some little jitter, they all take the shortest route. They all have the same occupancy pattern. But then we can start building cognitively plausible agents that at any stage of their movement look up whether they have a memory of where in the building their target should be, that look up at their visual system, how much information they can see, and try to identify and interpret the spatial cues that are provided by the furniture, by the depth of the field of vision, by the visibility of staircases and other open spaces, and thus build their movement patterns around that, clearly not going on the shortest path, but on cognitively plausible paths that are based on only allowing the agent to have access to information that you could reasonably assume a human person also to have. And when we then fuse the data that comes from the virtual reality experiments and the data that comes from the agents, from the agent simulation, we do find a very good correspondence. Of course, not one-on-one, and there's different variance and variability, definitely in the human data compared to anything you would ever capture with a designed artificial agent. But what we find is that both the vision-based cognitive agent and the human participants are quite sensitive to the variations of the base case, the atrium variation of the building, and the glass variation of the building. And thus we find that clearly, in order to capture the human participants' behavior, if you wanted to predict that without every time having to run another online experiment, you can quite nicely approximate that with our vision-based cognitive agents. This is basically the same data illustrated at higher resolution. Again, you have the direct routing or shortest path agents, you have the cognitive agents and the participants in the three variations. And you clearly see that the only meaningful way of getting a correspondence is to put in some vision-based and some memory-based elements rather than rely on overly simplified, yet perfectly well-behaving agents here. And let me also put this in a larger context, because our efforts at the center, both in Singapore and in Zurich, are not only to push forward foundational or applied research, and clearly we have a bit of a breadth here with the research that's in smaller spaces and targeted more clearly at the architects, and the large scale research with Sea Hero Press that I just also showed. But this is all really at the research side of things. But another mission that we have is to translate from research into teaching, both teaching to practitioners, but also strongly teaching to university students from architecture and related spatial design disciplines, and making them sensitive to what cognitive science and behavioral sciences and observations and measurement of human behavior have to offer, but also to develop and make available a set of tools that allows architecture students and architects in different stages of design to anticipate, with the help of agent modeling, with visibility analysis, proximity analysis, little experiments they can do in the computer, as well as the agent-based simulation, to get a much better understanding of the potential of their designs, be it as individuals or be it as teams of designers that can then question and scrutinize their own design intentions and design ideas and systematically test how far they can bring the human side of things. And let me finish off by just showing you a very few illustrations of yet another stream of our research, which is on digital twins for spatial human behavior analysis, which ultimately also makes a bit more of a link between our two research programs, Future Cities Laboratory and Future Resilient Systems, because in both of those labs, albeit at different spatial scales and for different phenomena, this notion of digital twins is becoming more and more important. So we have the research that we do in artificial environments, in virtual environments, or in virtual reality replicas of environments, but we also collect data in real spaces. That typically is quite labor intensive because you need observers and you need experimenters to target the experiment. But that, of course, generates very different data from just naturally occurring data. So unlike all the studies I gave you before, where our participants have a clear task, in this digital twin approach, we look at a building or a set of buildings and just observe passively the natural behaviors that occur there to get an understanding of people's movement patterns. And I won't go into too much detail here. Actually, this is work done by my PhD student, Jascha Grübel, in a collaboration between psychology and computer science. And he just handed in to me a 500-page dissertation that goes in a lot of detail of this, but I'll just look at this from the psychologist's point of view, right? So the logic here is that in order to build such digital twins, you have to measure the physical environment, you have to analyze the data that you process, maybe do a bit of machine learning on them, and then you have to find ways of visualizing your data again, perhaps in a virtual environment. And I'll just give you a bit of a glimpse of what that might look like. The measuring of the physical environment happens in the dense indoor sensor networks with LoRaWAN-based sensors. Then we can look at building occupancy, and our use case here is building occupancy during COVID-19, and then looking at fused twins visualizations of the kind of data that we can capture. So what we have done is in the office building where my office and my team's offices are, we put in 390 sensor devices, a couple of gateways distributed across 8 floors and 21 rooms, covering some distance. And we collected data from these sensor devices over a long period of time, several months, and collected what currently is the largest data set in terms of LoRaWAN-based dense indoor human-centered movement data with 180 million sensor data points that represents a total of 32 months worth of data. And we are still collecting data even beyond the current phase of the PhD. Just to give you a bit of an illustration, this is one of the lecture halls, right? There's different types of devices that are put under the ceiling and on the walls. And again, not going into too much detail. We have CO2 and volatile organic component measures. We have motion detection, brightness, humidity, temperature measures distributed across these devices that all have a low footprint in terms of their energy consumption, and that all then send their data back to the gateways and for centralized processing. As you see here, none of these sensors do anything that would be privacy relevant because there's no video data collected. I'll come back to that in a minute. And it turns out that looking at CO2 and VOC, noise and motion is, of course, a very good combination to generate this kind of data. This should also be a movie, yes. Right, this is a virtual replica of the building, indicating the position of all of those sensors distributed across the building. And of course, this illustration, this level 1 digital twin, if you will, can then be augmented with data patterns that we observe. Again, very briefly, what we find is this weekly rhythm of the building being much less occupied on the weekends than during the week, and less occupied at night than during the day. And this is sensitive in all of those different, of course, highly correlated traces. Not go into any details here, so you can zoom in much more and find differences between the reliability and predictiveness for different settings from different sensors. Although overall, if there's a lot of people moving about, they all tend to be sensitive to that. Let me illustrate this with a natural experiment that we did in the COVID-19 context. And here we really, well, made the best out of a bad situation, right? Because this digital twin setup was supposed to collect motion data of lots of people really using the building. And then COVID-19 hits. And then for some part of the time, the building is virtually empty because nobody is there. And then unlike parts of Southeast Asia and China, there has been a very interesting dynamic in lockdowns and opening up again, and different restrictions happening over the period of the core 2 years that COVID-19 was strongly on the agenda here in Switzerland. And what we can find is that the 10 specific policy actions have a clear impact on how many people are in the building and how strongly that is reflected in the various sensors. And what you see here is a shift over time with occupancy patterns as measured by our sensors going strongly down during the first lockdown. Then researchers have individual access again. When public access is allowed again, it goes up again. But then, of course, COVID struck again, and we have had again work from home, another lockdown, the hybrid use, part-time office policies. Then again, it did, and then what's called also in Switzerland a new normal, where then you have patterns again that are more at average. And it turns out that in all of these parts of the building, the sensor network is very sensitive to the occupancy differences that are triggered by COVID. And in this sense, COVID served for us as a natural experiment in terms of systematically changing the access to the building based on government policy, and illustrates without any video recording or something that these sensors naturally pick up these differences in occupancy. And maybe another illustration is here the level of activity measured by our sensors during a period where public access was allowed again at the bottom, and the real emptiness during the first lockdown period. Again, I'll not go into any details of the technical setup here, but suffice it to say that we collect the data, visualize it in the digital world, and try to find the correspondence between the physical and digital world representation. And this is just two illustrations. We've worked with HoloLens to digitally overlay the positioning of the sensors, and that can be augmented with different types of information about sensor performance over time in the building, but also then with pop-ups illustrating the time course. And of course, there is this HoloLens-based immersive variant there. You walk through the building to illustrate or familiarize yourself with certain spatial differences on the one side, but there's also, of course, views that are more traditionally desktop-based to give you summary statistics, etc., that illustrate different purposes. And I think I skipped one element here as well. Of course, one would be interested in finding a ground truthing of how reliable these sensors are beyond the natural experiment happening in COVID-19. For that purpose, we did obtain permission to put up video cameras to capture movement data with video. That video recording is not stored anywhere because that would be by Swiss data standards very problematic. What actually happens is it goes directly into a pre-processing where it is rendered into just a post estimation of the limbs of the person that is stored and can then be played back as animated virtual reality avatars rather than the real video data. And here again, we have a way of ground truthing whether there's a strong correspondence between the video-based data collected, for which we do not need to identify people. We just need to identify how many people are in a scene, how quickly they move, whether they stand and move, which is done always the machine learning based post estimation. The original video data can be thrown away on the spot, which was very important for our ethics committee. And then you have a large data set collected over several months again of video data that you can then correlate with the data from the sensor network. And this is ongoing work, so I'm not going to speculate on the details of how strong the correspondence is right now. And I think I will now stop and thank you for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Do you have any questions? So now it's a question and answer session.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Jacob, go ahead.
Anyone? Yeah,
Okay.
please go ahead.
Yeah, so I teach qualitative methods, research methods, and I like to have a unit on how the built environment and architecture influences social interactions, inequalities, and behaviors in the sociology department. And I'm wondering, it seems like you have a lot, your data gets at a lot, behavior. I suppose you could get at like some interesting attitude, behavioral inconsistencies and correct a lot of information with surveys by like actually talking with people. But I'm wondering, since you've been working on this for a long time, if you can think of ways like qualitative research methods. I know the distinction is really artificial. I think so. But like what sort of things you could further bring into this to better understanding of how people interact within space. And if you can recommend any research sources of literature on this, because I just kind of encounter observations of this subject like here and there and everywhere. I haven't really found like a nice presentation of this.
Well, Jacob, thank you for the question. So you're a sociologist and you want to work in this domain. So that's great. I don't really think that the distinction between quantitative and qualitative is that artificial. At the same time, I think it's extremely desirable to bridge where one can, right? And the more removed we are from our study participants or interlocutors or partners in research, right, the more difficult it is to meaningfully capture the qualitative side of data. So what we often try to do is augment the hard fact data, the quantitative data, the behavioral data with people's individual assessments, the qualitative data. And there's various ways of doing that. One is what in cognitive psychology mostly is called thinking aloud protocols, where while people are performing the task, you also ask them to comment on it, right? And that can reveal a lot of data, a lot of insights. Of course, it's laden with a lot of variability because people have different associations while they're walking about or doing a task, etc. But you're clearly familiar with these challenges of qualitative data. But perhaps more importantly, under certain circumstances, the fact that you also babble about, right, can perhaps alter your behaviors. And especially if it's not only just the thinking aloud of what comes to your head, but if it is more reflective. And I think when it comes to socially relevant questions and environmental assessments and situational assessments and reflecting on your role in an environment, how does an environment impact you? How does it impact your social peers, your family? How do you feel for the safety of your children? Just to come up with some topics here, right? Then the data collection is not as non-reactive as you might as a behavior scientist want it to be. And then you have to somehow in time separate the collection of the quantitative data from the qualitative data. And just to give you an example, and this is ongoing work, and I can't point you to any good publications on it. Also, we haven't published anything, but recently we started working in a hospital, observing the behaviors of nurses and doctors, right? And there it's very clear, while they are performing their task, you must not interfere with what they're doing, right? So you might be able to put some passive sensors on them, ideally in a privacy-preserving way that does not hamper the patient or the caregiver, right? You might put all sorts of passive sensors in the environment that track their movement, track who's meeting whom, how often do they deal with the digital devices, etc. But you must not interfere while they are saving lives, right? But you can make these, you can record that data, maybe augment it with some video, etc. And then you do what also in my original human-computer interaction domain often is called this retrospective thinking aloud, or video confrontation, or more generally data confrontation, where you expose the person who has contributed to a data trace with that data trace at a later time, and invite them to comment on or reflect on, or maybe even discuss as a group if you do a focus group like setting, etc., to identify, okay, what was it? And maybe in this nursing context or doctor context, I'm just making up a scenario here for illustration, right? You might identify from your data stream, oh, there were these very busy times when people at 3 o'clock, everybody was running around, and at 3:30 things were calm again. And in this part, you had these interactions and these, and then you later ask people to reflect on that, maybe in a group setting, maybe individually, when there's time again. And I think this temporal separation between collecting the quantitative data and the qualitative data can sometimes be a bridge. Mm-hmm. Do I have good literature to recommend on that? Unfortunately, no, but I'll think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Does that partly address your question?
Yeah. I've just noticed a lot of, I thought this is a very important like method or way to something to study that often it just comes in here and there kind of miscellaneously, but there's not really like a method, I feel like, in sociology, at least, for studying built environments and architecture. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe picking up the sociology element, right? So there's this research tradition that comes out of University College London that's often branded very methodologically as space syntax, and rightly so, but there actually are sociologists involved there. The very old book by Julianne Hansen and Bill Hillier called The Social Logic of Space might be, from a sociological point of view, a bit outdated. I'm not a sociologist, so I can't judge that, but that could be a starting point. And depending on what you're interested in, just pop me an email and maybe I can connect you to some people who might be relevant.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, very stimulating talk. So regarding the work published in Nature, I think the participants could be very different in different cities. So I was wondering if you control for the variables like people's occupation, experience, etc. Because some people just stay at home, people travel a lot in the city and could make a difference in their spatial navigation abilities.
Yeah, so the short answer is unfortunately no, right? But let me elaborate a little bit on this, right? So the one thing I skipped over also in about the Nature study, that's a smaller part of what's covered there, right? There's this replication study, an online experiment on a desktop environment rather than the phone environment, where people were systematically exposed and recruited from an online panel rather than the 4 million people in the video game context. There's a bit more control there. Also, there's more systematic control in terms of the variation of the game environment, right? And the population from which these volunteers are drawn. This tends to be more homogeneous if you go for a panel-based study rather than releasing releasing a video game with a big sponsor in the wild. So that partly addresses it by this combination of more selected participants and more controlled gaming environment. But that's only one element of it. The other is, if you look in the larger picture of also what other researchers using game environments have found out, is that that gaming, much more than 20 years ago, is part of the middle of society, if you will, right? So when I was young, well, everybody who played video games was also young, or most people, right? Nowadays, the average age of gamers is 35. Also, if you look at the data that we collected, right? Yes, of course, there's many more people under 30 than over 30 in the sample, but you can, if you stratify, again, by looking at different age groups, different countries, etc., you can compensate for a lot of that. And I think that also in the findings about socioeconomic differences and cultural differences and the gender differences, there's a lot of that, of course, glossed over in what you just said, right? It's not useful to assume that less developed countries would have a similar breadth or range of socioeconomic statuses represented in a data set like this. And especially the data set is a few years old already, right? So I would assume that from certain countries, there's disproportionately many people from the top 10% of the socioeconomic spectrum of that country. That would be for the poorer countries, right? Well, for a country like North America or Hong Kong, Singapore, you would have much more just of the middle in the data set, right? And you always have to bear that a little bit in mind when you interpret the data. The degree of representativeness of a data set like this varies between countries, and this is why it's then important to have these mixed linear models where you try to control for as many of those variables as possible, and then focus on the one that remains and try to interpret it separately from the others.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Any other? Yeah, please.
Hi, yeah. So hi from Zurich.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. So we do research also on mobility and spatial use in older adults, particularly. So we're interested in aging and what sort of healthy aging looks like in terms of spatial behavior. Not so much really, so this architectural sort of within building perspective is more specific to what we do. But so this was really interesting. And I have a question regarding the Sea Hero Quest, this impressive large online data set that you have. And if I understand it correctly, you showed cross-sectional age differences rather than true longitudinal decline. And
Absolutely.
I mean, as a lifespan psychologist, I'd like to sort of highlight the differences between these. But I was wondering, is there an opportunity to have people engage with this task, again? I mean, do you have, for data protection reasons, any ability to link these people, or would they just be new users if your study runs for the next 10 years and people sort of do the game play it again?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for pointing to the difference or the relevance, especially in aging research, for the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal data. And clearly, although this video game has been online for a few years and is no longer online, right? That main data collection does not provide any opportunity for longitudinal work, right? But of course, the colleagues that are more at the aging research end, especially Michael Hornberger and various consortia around that, have collected various data sets targeted with elderly people at different stages of decline. And they started, 10 years ago now on doing that, right? So they increasingly will have access to longitudinal data. And that would be the point to go for. I'm not actively involved as an author on that strand of the research, and Michael and Hugo Spears, they actively curate this. And I think if you have any interest, I can connect you with them, or you can just approach them separately. They will be more than happy to share their data both the base data and access to other data sources, and maybe link up with the kind of work that you do. Christina, may I ask what group are you in? Are you at the psychology department?
Well, no, I'm not really. We're affiliated with the psychology department. So I'm at the Center for Gerontology, and we have what's called these university research priority programs at UCH, and we're at the one Dynamics of Healthy Aging. And so we're closely collaborating with the geographics people, Rübi Weibel and his team, and some work with Sarah Fabrikant. And so we developed this tracker. We're actually also collaborating with colleagues in Hong Kong. So this is really very interesting. So
it's great to meet you in Hong Kong today. Yes, I think we should have coffee.
I know this is very funny.
Reach out to me separately, and we can connect some more.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me read the questions from the. There is a question. Thank you for the talk. Could navigation behavior be used to assess other cognitive or perceptive aspects other than dementia? For example, the aesthetic aspect or security feeling of an area. From
great question,
Vincent. Yeah.
Great question. So actually, yes. The short answer here is yes. The long answer is there is a research tradition at the interface between cognitive psychology and this whole discourse on space syntax that looks at, for example, security feeling of an area. And that's linked also to what we call social navigation or social wayfinding. It is about the fact that the co-presence of other people in the built environment can be an indicator of certain properties, right? So you don't want to walk alone through a dark alley at night, right? And you have a very different spatial feeling in a crowded underground station than maybe in a remote countryside. And so security feelings clearly have been looked at this interface of architecture, sociology, and psychology. And some of our studies can be repurposed in that direction. And yes, the aesthetical aspect also plays a role when we do our research on appraisal of built spaces, right? There's often an emphasis on, is it making me feel stressed, etc., right? But that is not independent of the aesthetic appraisal. Right. So, and it's also linked to people's attitudes to greenery, etc., which has also beneficial but not universally beneficial health elements. I don't know, Vincent, if you want to raise the question yourself and explain a bit the background of your question.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Actually, background of the question is that actually we are working on the evaluation of the feeling that space is producing on people, actually, and mainly by analyzing 360-degree pictures, because for the moment people are not using these full panoramic pictures. And we were expecting if actually the gathering of data is quite difficult because you have set up this nice application with, but we have not the same means for the moment. And the problem is gathering the data. And so I was wondering if navigation, because it is easy to gather navigation data, and was wondering if by gathering navigation data, we could assess actually the aesthetical feeling or the security feeling that could be produced on a space, on the people. And maybe we could address all the feelings, because it could be done with, I don't know, there is I don't know if you know the PlacePulse 2 datasets.
No, I don't, but
which
I would be
is,
happy to learn.
Yeah, which is evaluated since during 3 years, actually, the 6 qualities of urban spaces: boring and lively and security feeling and kind of things. And then they try to produce a deep learning model to evaluate automatically the quality of the space depending on the picture, just starting from picture, Google Studio picture. And so now we try to expand this work using panoramic data. And now we try to gather data, but gathering data is very difficult. So I was wondering is by gathering navigation data, we could continue this work.
I think you can, and I would be happy if you want to. Again, if you drop me an email, I can also link you with some people, because this is a topic that definitely some of the work of my direct colleague Bruce Dalton fits with, right?
Yeah.
But also, and I didn't talk about that at all today. We do have some active research on the impact of greenery, etc. There's just a paper out in Nature Scientific Reports just last week, driven by my colleague Panos Mavros, who's running our lab in Singapore and who will start at Paris Telecom in December as a new professor. And that would be a good opportunity to maybe look at the concerns that you have. So if you approach me separately, I would be very happy to dig deeper here with you and some colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Johannes.
Any other questions from the audience? Any students? It's a good opportunity if you have questions. So if anyone has questions, you can just directly speak up. So if we have no questions, then that's the end of this session, I guess. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming to our seminar. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for the
very much.
invitation. And let me maybe add that that if any further questions come up from the audience, everybody, you'll find me on Google, right? I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm always happy to engage in conversation. Do not hesitate to contact me or my colleagues on the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Also, thank you, Lixiang. Yeah. Bye.
Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye bye, everyone.